Welcome to IR 213, The Global Economy. My name is Iwan Baik, and today I will be giving a short lecture on colonialism. But before we go into colonialism, I want to first cover externalities and make sure we have that concept down, because we didn't have a video for a lecture on current debates in trade policy. Okay, so what are externalities? An externality is a cost or a benefit from a good or a service to an unrelated third party. So not the producer or the consumer of the good or a service. What does this mean, right? You usually have two people involved in an economic transaction. You've got a buyer and a seller. And the price of the item is driven by how much value that item has to the buyer, right? Their willingness to pay and how costly it is for the seller to make it, their willingness to produce, to supply. And that's going to set the market price. So in a free market, that's all that's factored into the price, the value to the buyer and the cost of production for the seller. But oftentimes, there are effects of that transaction that affect people external to that dyad, a third party that's not a buyer or a seller. And this side effect is called an externality. So an externality can be both negative or positive. A classic example of a negative externality is, let's say there's a power plant that's producing energy and I'm a consumer and I am buying electricity. So there's this transaction. An externality of that transaction is the pollution, right, which creates global warming and bad air quality, both of which are harming a lot of people who are neither the power plant owner nor the purchaser of that power. And all that harm, that social cost, it doesn't show up in the price. So when you have a negative externality, a harm associated with this transaction that's not reflected in the price, an inefficiently high amount of that product is going to be produced and sold. So unless the government intervenes with clean air regulation or a tax on carbon, a free market is going to produce too much coal-powered energy. The price of the energy will be artificially low because we're not pricing in the cost of this externality. And the same thing is true for positive externalities, except instead of producing too much, we'll end up producing too little. A classic example is education, right? You all are paying money to USC for your education. And as the consumer, you will hopefully reap a lot of the benefits of that education, right? Most notably, in terms of higher wages, and also perhaps a richer life because of a deeper intellectual understanding of what's going on around you in the world. And also a richer life because of all the social ties that you form while you are at college. But you aside, society around you will also reap a lot of those benefits, right? Many of you will go on to create new innovations and technology that drive economic growth and make everyone around you more productive, or create works of art that create beauty and joy in the world. The fact that you'll be productive in the economy means you will pay taxes and pay for government services that end up being consumed by other people. So there's a variety of ways through which you're getting education that will create value, not only for yourself, but also for other people, which is why governments often step in and subsidize education. K through 12 education is subsidized very heavily in the States because the idea is that when people learn to read and write and to do math, this benefits not just the person who's getting the education, but also to society much more broadly. So if things have a positive externality, positive side effects in a free market world, we're producing an inefficiently low amount of it, right? If there's only private education, we would be producing and consuming too little of quality education. And more often than not, externalities are negative, but either way, whether they are negative or positive, externalities cause inefficiencies in the market, right? Either setting inefficiently low or inefficiently high amounts that are made and sold. So in 1970, Milton Friedman, a famous pro-free market economist, he wrote a famous article called "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." And the one-line summary of this pro-free market argument was that greed is good, right? The best thing we can do is encourage firms to freely maximize their profits. And Friedman said in this article, you know, the free market is great and everything's going to be great as long as all the externalities are reflected in the final price. The caveat of this sentence is that in order to reflect the externalities in the final price, we actually need a very active government that can intervene. So if there are negative externalities, right, if there's an external social cost that's not being accounted for and something is being produced too much, then the government should impose regulations or taxes to try to decrease production. And if there's a positive externality, a social benefit that's not being accounted for, the government should subsidize more production because the item isn't being produced enough. It turns out that, ironically, for a free market to be really efficient, we actually need a highly active government. And this sometimes gets lost in some of the political discussion around free market economics. So remember externalities. This is a term relevant to current trade policy, and understanding and applying it to the paper and debate project will be helpful. Okay, so now on to the main part of today's lecture, which is colonialism. In the last lecture, we discussed the history of trade, in which Professor Graham beautifully summarized a long period of history to explain how humankind, during the past millennium, have grown from a state in which most of humanity, close to 99%, lived on the edge of starvation, to today, where about 7 to 9% of the world population live under $2 a day. Can and should we do better? Yes, but still, this is quite an impressive achievement. But as Professor Graham also pointed out, this path of growth has also been fraught with terrible things. And colonialism is a good example of this. So today, we're continuing to talk about trade and development by talking about the history of colonialism. In fact, we can't really talk about trade and development without discussing how colonialism has impacted the development trajectories of countries. Mind you, not just the colonized countries, but the colonizers as well. So if you look at this map, you can see that most of the world has been colonized by Europe. And the few orange countries, which are supposedly the countries that have been untouched by Europe, also have their own experience with colonialism. For example, in Asia, Korea here was colonized by Japan, right? So really, almost the whole world has some degree of experience with colonialism, whether as a colonizer or being a colony. So what does colonialism usually look like? The basic economic model is that the colonies were producing raw materials: cotton, sugar, wheat, tobacco, iron ore, lumber, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of mining, a lot of agriculture. And then these agricultural and mineral commodities are shipped to the metropole so that trade happens exclusively between the colonizing state and the colony. So basically, the colonies existed primarily for the benefit of the mother country. Colonies were not allowed to trade their materials with anyone but the mother country. They were not allowed to manufacture their raw materials into goods that they could export. And this often led to a dependence, on raw materials and commodities. So, for example, in the 1600s, the English Parliament passed 4 navigation acts, which made sure that they were in full control of setting the terms of trade so that they reaped all the gains. These rules proclaimed that only English or English colonial ships could carry cargo between English colonial ports. The exports could not be shipped to any other nation unless it first went through England or Scotland. English colonies could not compete with English manufacturers, and England always had to have a favorable balance of trade. And as can be expected, colonial governments tended to make very low investments in infrastructure and human capital, right? They weren't building world-class schools and wonderful roads and great sewer systems. They're making minimal investments on the infrastructure front, spending as little as possible to exploit and reap as much profit as possible. Essentially, they would just build roads to get natural resources to the ports, and they would build a port where these goods can be boarded on ships so that they can be sent back to the colonizing country. And in most cases, this was the only infrastructure investment going on. So coming back to the age-old question, why are rich countries rich and poor countries poor? We see that not all colonies experienced the same path during and after colonialism. And when we're looking at how colonial origins impacted comparative development, some names to remember are Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. Their 2001 article called "The Colonial Origins of Comparative Development" has been cited over 16,000 times. And these professors have continued to work on answering this question, including their famous book published in 2012 called "Why Nations Fail." So what did these authors say? Basically, they argue that the long-run consequences of colonial rule depended on the types of institutions that were set up in colonies. And according to these authors, there are mainly 2 types of institutions, right? There are extractive institutions, which are based on the control and extraction of rents from indigenous peoples, such as forced labor, right? And these institutions are likely to lead to economic stagnation. And there are also inclusive institutions, which include things like private property, political rights that are enforced through rule of law. And places with inclusive institutions have done better, right? Because these institutions, in contrast to extractive institutions, create incentives and opportunities for more people. So what determines what kinds of institutions are set up? The authors identify two interesting variables, right? The first is the density of indigenous population. An example of this is Latin America, where there were already like dense populations of indigenous people. And in these cases, a colonial society could be created based on the exploitation of these people. So it was more likely that extractive institutions, like systems of forced labor, would be set up with the sole intention of transferring resources rapidly to the metropole. And these institutions were, of course, detrimental to the welfare of the indigenous population, and were also really bad for attracting investment or any sort of economic progress. A contrasting example is North America, where while there were indigenous people, they were not as densely gathered and more sparsely kind of spread out across the continent. And of course, we have to remember that these less dense populations was definitely partly due to, and certainly made much worse by the fact that Europeans brought with them all sorts of diseases like smallpox, and committed genocide, essentially wiping out the indigenous population, which is a big part of the story in settler colonies like the US and Australia. So in North America, it was hard to set up extractive institutions to exploit indigenous people, even though the first British settlers did try to set it up. And so as a result, early North American society went in a completely different direction from Latin America. So early colonizing ventures, such as the Virginia Company, needed to attract Europeans to first come to North America. And once they got here, you had to rely on these settlers, right, for both investment and labor, right? You had to incentivize them to be productive and generate more revenue. And so what sort of incentivizing institutions would these be? Political rights, for one thing, right? Give these people a say in how they are ruled. Property rights would be another, right? Giving them access and ownership to land so that they can cultivate agriculture and be productive. Rule of law, right? And that would ensure that these political rights and property rights were enforced and followed. And another important variable that influenced what sort of institutions that were set up, besides the density of the existing population, was the disease environment for the potential European settlers. So Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson looked at the death rates of early European settlers in colonial regions between the 1600s and 1800s. And again, North America, something that encouraged the colonization of North America was the relatively benign disease environment. European settlers could live easily without fear of high mortality owing to tropical diseases or other threats, right? They brought diseases to the new continent, but they themselves were relatively less affected by it. In these regions, people from the colonial powers went and settled in the colonies, and they were able to create institutions that provided better public goods, like better education and better roads, and institutions that were capable, again, of enforcing property rights through the rule of law. In contrast, West Africa was sometimes called the white man's graveyard because the disease environment there was hostile for the white people that tried to settle there. So because the first white people that went there ended up dying a lot from tropical diseases like malaria, it was hard to attract families to come and settle down. So instead, you're just sending some soldiers and missionaries and keeping these small garrison states rather than creating settler colonies. And so this discouraged the creation of the type of inclusive economic institutions which happened in North America, and instead encouraged the creation of extractive institutions. Now, of course, as we all know, these so-called inclusive institutions, like political and property rights and public goods, they were not inclusive of the native populations of these colonies. As we've said, in the US, Canada, Australia, genocide was conducted against the native populations, and it was primarily the white settler population that was able to reap the benefits of these institutions before and after colonialism. So this is not to be overlooked. But the point is that the density of the indigenous populations and the mortality rates for white settlers, while they seem kind of unrelated to today's economy actually show a strong correlation. They help explain what kind of institutions were set in motion in these colonies, impacting long-term growth trajectories. Now, the authors also point out that institutional differences led to different results, not just for the colonies, but for the colonizers as well. So the discovery of colonies in the Americas, then in Asia and Africa, potentially helped to spur institutional and economic development, setting in motion some of the prerequisites for what was to become the Industrial Revolution, right? And the way this worked also depended on institutional differences within Europe. So in places like Britain, the monarchy was weakened earlier on, and the parliament and society had a bigger say. So this meant the economic opportunities from colonialism further strengthened the industrial and mercantile class in England, so that they could push for improved political and economic institutions, leading to economic growth. And Britain was the first country to have the Industrial Revolution and become the most powerful country in the world, right? But in other places like Spain, for example, where the initial political institutions and the balance of power were different, the outcome was also different. So in places like this, the monarchy dominated society, and they also dominated, trade and economic opportunities. And in consequence, political institutions became weaker and the economy ultimately declined. So we can see that colonialism for Europe drove economic growth in some parts of Europe and slowed it down in others. And also, it's important to note, what I've said so far makes it seem like, oh, it's good to be a British colony. Britain left behind better institutions than other countries. But the authors emphasize that it's not that Britain went in and planted British institutions, France went in and planted French institutions, Spain went in and planted Spanish institutions, right? These European powers didn't go into colonies with different institutions at the outset. In fact, the authors argue that the intentions and strategies of these different European powers were actually pretty similar, right? So, for example, when British colonizers found circumstances that were similar to like Latin America, for example, in South Africa, Kenya, or Zimbabwe, they were perfectly capable of and interested in setting up extractive institutions. So this is not a story of, oh, North America succeeded because they inherited British institutions, while Latin America failed because of Spanish institutions, right? The outcomes were different because of the variation in the initial conditions in the colonies, by which we're talking about the density of the native population and the disease environment for settlers. And some people also like to say, oh, British colonies have done better because they learned how to speak English. And English is the lingua franca, right? The #1 language spoken around the world. So knowing English helped these countries, these former colonies, in joining world trade and to grow economically. But if you think about it, English is the lingua franca of the world because England was the #1 power in the world. And a big reason England was able to become the #1 power in the world was because, as we just talked about, the political and economic institutions in England were shaped so that they could grow the industrial and mercantile class rather than have all the colonial earnings go straight to the monarchy, as in some other European countries. So institutions really matter, right? Now, we're not saying that colonial institutions alone can determine whether a country turns out rich or poor, right? The world is too complicated for such a simplistic explanation. For example, North Korea and South Korea are two countries that used to be one country under Japanese colonial rule. So despite sharing the same colonial experience and the same institutions, the two countries went on to have very different growth trajectories. Or there are some countries, the few countries that never experienced colonialism at all, China, Iran, Nepal, Thailand. Granted, they were under European spheres of influence. But anyway, they also experienced different levels of development. So the effects are heterogeneous. And also, the fact that some institutions led to economic growth is not to say that there is some form of good colonialism, right? Colonialism left lasting harms besides these domestic institutions, right? Just off the top of our head, the slave trade, right? European colonization of the Americas created huge demands for slaves. And if you look at this map of Africa, Europe, went in and carved it up without regarding to existing borders, right? Arbitrarily separating ethnic groups. And then within borders, within colonial borders, like these European powers utilized the divide and conquer policy, which meant deliberately keeping religious groups and ethnicities groups divided to better control them, encouraging resentment and conflict between these groups. And so these sorts of policies really set the ground for civil and international wars long after the colonial powers left, which also have an important effect on development. Nevertheless, institutions are important for understanding post-colonial economic development, right? So the initial conditions of the colonies that determined the sort of institutions that were set in place are still correlated with the levels of economic development today. And so there are fine-grained variations in the colonial model, but these questions can help us understand the colonial legacies in different countries, right? So how much investment was there in infrastructure and education? Were there efficient courts? Was there rule of law? And importantly, this was rarely the case that it extended to the whole population, but did the protection of the courts extend to, at least in part, to some of the colonized population? And did the institutions survive when the colonizers left, right? How much of it survived and in what way? So keep these questions in mind. And in the next lecture, we're going to delve into the post-colonial era and see how trade and development progressed following the end of World War II.